Hi there, guys, um, and girls, I suppose. I am now at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, which seems actually like a pretty good place to record this on a Super Bowl Sunday. I just watched the Eagles win. I actually, sort of unintentionally, but probably had this in the back of my mind. When I went on this trip, I packed two sweaters, one green and one red for today, depending on who won. So you get the green one. Um, I will say that my son is quite happy. He's a Bills fan, but he was, you know, willing to root against um, anybody who was going against Taylor Swift's boyfriend. So, um, in any case, today we're going to be talking about existentialism, and it's going to be relatively short. Last time the recording was long. I've also noticed that there were a lot of you who didn't watch it, and I would say that last time, if you haven't watched that video, you really ought to. So I'm gonna make this short so that you can like go and take a gander at that one. Existentialism actually, in some ways, relates to what we were talking about with metaphysics. Existentialism is from the word exist, okay, and it's looking at existence and at what it means to be. But unlike the metaphysics that we were talking about with Aristotle, it is looking at it more from our perspective, from a personal perspective. So, the existentialists tended to be mostly Europeans, and mostly in the kind of 20th century, particularly between World War One and World War Two. And what the existentialists were talking about was the sort of like dichotomy of being. Okay, and if you think about what you might know about the 1920s, okay, we often call them the Roaring Twenties, and we can think about like flappers in their like sexy dresses and you know speakeasies and gangsters and all that stuff. Um, and there is a truth to that, that is what that era was like. But the flip side of that era was that the other part of what that era was like was the fact that so many men, and particularly in Europe, this was even more true. So many men had died kind of horrific deaths in World War One, and you know the response to that was complicated. For the men who survived, a lot of them had what we would today call PTSD, but they didn't know how to deal with it back then. And so, like drowning yourself in alcohol or in sex or in, any sort of outlet that they could to try and escape from the horrors that they'd witnessed and experienced, that was something. Okay. You also had an entire generation, and if you think about this from, let's say you were a senior in high school at a British high school. They don't call them seniors, but the equivalent of a senior at a British high school in 1914. And you were a guy. Chances are, by 1918, you were dead. Okay. There was this whole period where, like, an entire generation of men, and really, like, in some ways, and I don't mean this to belittle you who are, at this age, but like boys, died. And, the women who were left had lost like all the men that they grew up with, all the men that they knew. A lot of them had lost their boyfriends, or people got married earlier back then, their husbands, and there was no one. If you were a girl in 1914 in Britain, um, uh, it wasn't just your year of men that died. It was like, the people who had been seniors 2 or 3 years before you, and the people who had been like juniors and sophomores behind you. And so there was a lot of loneliness. There was a lot of despair. Um, and so the 1920s were a reaction to that. And the reaction after that, then we had the Great Depression, and it was worse in America than it was in Europe, but it also hit Europe. And then we had the rise of fascism and the Second World War. And so this period was rife with very high emotions and very low emotions. And in a lot of ways, more low emotions, but sort of extreme reactions to those low emotions, where, there was sort of like, there's this old Latin phrase, and I'm going to give it to you in English, but it's, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. All right? And, this feeling that life is short, and you have to pack as much into it as you can. Maybe from when I was a teenager, we would have said something along the lines of like, like live fast, die young, like leave a good looking corpse. Something that I obviously am not going to do, but that was the same ethos of that period of time. And so the writers and there is this like strange, like there's people who are writing and they're simultaneously philosophers. And if you look at a lot of the authors at the time, they dip into philosophy, and if you look at a lot of the philosophers at the time, they dip into literature. So there's sort of a both sides of that coin. But they're reflecting the same ideas, and the ideas they're reflecting are all about like what it means to be. But what it means to be when, for a lot of them, the answer to that question wasn't, God, the way Aristotle kind of came up with it, but instead what it means to be if, like, there is no God, if there's just like horror and death surrounding you. And so part of existentialism is like this almost like nihilistic, attitude where nothing matters, nothing lasts. And so, you just, you try and have a good time, but it's all meaningless. And there is a significant rise among the philosophers in particular of like atheism, or at least agnosticism. And, you can sort of understand that, because if you experience these horrors of war, you start to get what, like, the problem of evil. And we haven't talked about that. I might try to throw that in at some point because it's useful to talk about. But one of the big questions that we have about God, like riffing off of last class, is like, if God exists, why is there so much evil? Like, why does God allow evil? And so the answer for some of the men coming back from the Second World War and the First World War, the answer for some of them who had experienced those horrors is that, well, like, there can't be a God because God would never have allowed this. And so existentialism is born in part of people who are trying to figure out if there's any meaning. All right? If there is any sort of like way that we can like affirm human existence, even if it is fleeting and brief. And there are different answers. Okay. Sartre, who is probably the most famous of all the existentialists, is a French author. He worked, for the French resistance in World War II. And somebody sort of said to him, like, how can you, who doesn't believe in God and doesn't believe in an afterlife, risk your life in, you know, in this conflict that, like, you don't think it really matters because you're gonna die and that's it. And he sort of said, well, just because I don't believe in God doesn't mean that I can't believe in like goodness or beauty. And so I want to promote goodness and beauty to the extent that I can, and if that means that like I die earlier than if I like run away and hide, at least like I will have done something to promote that, to try to make the lives of other people better. But this, like, that was not a satisfying answer to a lot of people. And, among the people who corresponded with him, they're like, but, how can you say, like, there's this other strain of things where, like, existence is just pain, and we're just trying to dull the pain. And how can you believe in goodness or beauty when you can see all this pain everywhere? And so existentialism really has these two competing themes that keep like knocking heads, that are is existence about like pain and loss and despair and ultimately everything is futile, or are we headed towards something? Now, there were another group of existentialists at this time who answered this question in a very different way. And most of these people were less philosophers and more authors, but they tried, in their own ways, to suggest that there was love, or even for some of them like God, some sort of like higher power, and that even though there is suffering and massive amounts of suffering and massive amounts of pain, there is like simultaneously like goodness within humanity. And so we might be headed, towards evil times. We might suffer from a war or the Great Depression, but we also have the possibility of goodness. One of those writers who is not British, and it's probably something you're familiar with, is John Steinbeck. And, John Steinbeck was one of those, like, kind of large groups of authors who wrote, at least partially in between the wars, as did, like, Hemingway, as did, so many. I mean, in Britain, you had Evelyn Waugh. And, some of those authors, some of those novelists, or F. Scott Fitzgerald, okay, gave in to the despair, okay? Hemingway eventually committed suicide. But some of them, in fact, some of them really embraced this idea that there were, like, higher things, higher truths, even if we can't see them. And so, existentialism, what does it mean to be? Well, for their answer, whether they were kind of on the more nihilistic side or the more hopeful side, it was a recognition that pain is real, that suffering is real, and that is part of existence. And that another part of existence is like the attempt to escape from that pain. And so when we feel most alive, and actually I think that this is a really important insight for all of us. When we feel most alive are the moments of like great triumph and also great tragedy. Um, I'm thinking right now, actually, and this seems relatively minor, um, but I'm actually thinking about the Super Bowl. And if you are like Patrick Mahomes right now and you just lost, okay, well, the last 2 years you won. So, like, those are memories that, like, are gonna be part of his life for however long he's in football and then long after that. Um, and so, like, he has won the Super Bowl. He has rings. He's, like, held up the Lombardi trophy. Um, but he will also remember today and what a terrible game it was, and kind of how awful the whole day was. And that will also stick with him. Okay. Now, throughout the season for football, there are like wins and losses, and there are plays that he is never going to go back and remember, never think about again. And then there are plays, and they're either where things go really well or really badly, that will stick with him, that will like be embedded in his mind. And isn't it the same for all of us? Okay. We can remember like the great moments, the moments that we want to go back and relive, okay? Whether that is like your first kiss, or when you got your driver's license, or, a fabulous birthday party, or if you play sports, like the moment that you like did something marvelous that you know, everybody applauded you for. That was, you made a difference to your team, you won the game, you whatever it was. But you will also remember your moments of great failure. Okay. And I can sort of guarantee this to you as somebody who is, twice your age now, that, you will have a lot of both. And one of the points the existentialists make is that you can't avoid either, and that you can find meaning, for yourself at least, in both. So when things are really great, it is something to give you hope, to give you, a reason to continue. But when things aren't, when things go badly, when things are when you are at a low in your life, well, that's something to hold on to as well. It might not be a pleasant memory, although, and like this is perhaps more me than you, but I think everybody does this to a little bit, to a certain extent. We replay the disasters. We think about what could we have done. I was just listening to Tom Brady, and whatever you think of Tom Brady as a football player, and I really liked him. I thought he was amazing. He's a terrible commentator. I just like listening to him is painful. But okay, he said something about how he replays the losses. He won 7 Super Bowls, he lost 3. He thinks about the losses a lot more. And I think we do that. I think we tend to dwell on the negative. And the existentialist says, okay, like use the negative. Like you're alive for the negative. You like those are moments that are significant to you. But don't just use the negative, because if you only focus on the negative, existence is going to be that like nihilistic pursuit. And all you can do is drown yourself in like liquor and sorrow and regret and drugs and whatever, but it never makes it any better. And so even the existentialists who have that sort of nihilistic viewpoint want to also like act in some ways as a cautionary tale, that even though there is this pain in life, like letting it define you, letting it like pierce your heart is not the best way to live. Um, that we have to accept that as part of ourselves. And it's really our failure to accept failure, our failure to accept that, like, some of our lives are going to be miserable, that there's going to be bad moments that really hurt us. Because when people can't accept that, they can't live anymore. So if we accept tragedy, if we accept, the fact that we are going to die someday, we can at least attempt to live the life that we do have to the fullest. And then the more positive existentialists are also going to say, and we can learn from those mistakes, and we can do better in the future, and we can maintain some sort of hope. And so existentialism is, like, as a philosophy, I think actually really simple, but also like a lifelong process. And I've talked, I think, just a little bit in my philosophy courses about how psychology and philosophy used to be the same department, and there used to be like no differentiation. And some of existentialism like went into psychology eventually, and like, I don't want to say invented therapy, but there is a distinct connection between most of the modern ways therapists talk about loss and life and how to live, that reflects like some of the understandings that the existentialist philosophers wrote about. Okay. That was a quick 22 minutes, so we're going to stop there. If you did not watch the last video, please go watch the last video, because that is, to my mind, both more interesting and more important. And then I will do another one for you probably Tuesday night, at which point I don't remember where I'll be. I want to say I'll be at the University of Wisconsin. So, any case, so I will talk to you then. As ever, if you have questions, please feel free to email me, and go Eagles.